why is this anxiety that Latinos are facing right now when it comes to housing?
The anxiety isn't just, hey, the pressure from my family. It's, can I afford this? Can I live up to the expectation?
When you hear rent control, what is your response?
That's just a symptom, right? The question is, why is it that things are unaffordable, and how can we address that? And freezing the rent doesn't do that. The number of people looking for homes and the number of homes being built they're not keeping up to each other. What are the barriers, or what are the public policies that are empowering us to buy that first home? The reality is that the landscape has shifted. This isn't just Latinos, this is all Americans.
We're here today with Wadi Gaitan, Communications Director for the Libre Initiative. Wadi, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Excited to be on the podcast and talking about a topic that I think it's very exciting, personal. I think one that we all have top of mind.
Yeah, let's start there, Wadi, because I think before we dive into this topic, which frankly can be overwhelming for a lot of folks, including our community, talk to me a little bit about your personal experience. I know that you have real hands-on experience with in real estate and housing construction. How has that influenced your perspective, your outlook, your approach to these issues when it comes to policy?
Yeah, I think it's helped form my perspective for sure. My dad, he has a small business. It's focused on remodeling. He didn't start there. He started as a painter for the hotel chain Marriott. He was at one specific Marriott. He was a painter on site, and then one day decided to start building his business. And apart from having hotels still as his clients, one of his clients were real estate investors. And I didn't necessarily know that. I was coming out of high school, 17, 18 years old. I was in college, got to play soccer there, but I needed, that extra income to be able to pay for the books, be able to pay for the courses. So my dad said, yeah, come on, work with my remodeling company. We need, someone who knows the group, someone who I can coach and that he could trust in. So for me, it was just like a perfect side job while I'm going to school. But what happens, here's where the story gets interesting, is I start noticing something. As I'm there, again, their main focus on remodeling was painting. As I'm there helping the people who are putting up drywall, right? We're putting screws into 2x4s. Then there's the guy who does the plastering, and I'm coming behind them with the sandpaper and what we call in Spanish, lijando, right? Just sanding down that drywall, and I'm breathing all the the fumes from the paint. But what I notice is the guy pulling up in the nicer car, and he's the owner of the home. He's the guy that's doing the investing. And I'm like, well, I want to know what this guy is doing. I want to know, how is it that he's buying all these properties that we're coming in and doing all this work? So I just kind of started talking to these different investors and just kind of asked them, hey, what's your plan with this home? How did you get into this business? And what I quickly found is that all of these individuals had very similar goals, right? A lot of them was tied to money. They saw it as a way of building wealth, a way of building equity in a home, but also in a way of they understood how this helped your taxes, right? The depreciation. It's the word, something along those lines.
Yeah.
So basically, it helps you against your taxes when you have these investments and you keep them for a while. But they also talked about how for them it was something that they were able to do. Some of them work with their sons and daughters. It was for some of them it was a family business, and they also saw the value of, hey, how can I take something that's maybe run down, or a home that doesn't look as modern, and how can I turn it into something that a new family wants to come in? They saw it as a contribution to their area. So this really is the area that really sparked my attention when it came to housing. I grew up mostly in apartments, and I remember there was a time where we were in a 2-bedroom. It was me, my sister, my mom, and my dad, and we had maybe an uncle that was temporarily living in the living room, and then a little bit older, I remember same thing. We had our aunts and uncles and 3 cousins who came, and they were transitioning. So there was always somebody in and out of the house. And that sparked an interest for me of like, hey, I one day love the idea of having my own home, and also love the idea of being able to build a little bit of wealth, right? And I kind of saw real estate and investing as that avenue, and it shaped my thinking in it, because I was fortunate enough that when I started talking to these real estate investors, again, being kind of like the age of 18 to 20 years old, I set the goal very early on. I said, hey, when I graduate from college and I get that first job, right, that first, American dream job, being one of the first individuals from my family to be able to graduate from a university in the United States, I said, I want to buy that first project. And I didn't want to buy it as a home that I moved into. I wanted it to be a true real estate investment. I was able to do that right at the age I had just turned 25. So most of the work that I did was at age 24. And then in August, probably about like 7 days after my birthday, to turn in 25, I was able to buy my first project, and ever since done several. So this, to go to your original
Mhm.
question, it's really shaped my understanding of what goes into one, purchasing a home. So right, identifying the right place that someone wants to live. People look at neighborhood. People look at the schools nearby. Is it has access to a highway, metro transportation? Are there grocery stores nearby? Do I live close to my family? But folks also have to look at, safety is one of the issues, but they also want to look at, in the future, can I possibly resell this for a little bit more money? Can I rent it in the future if I want to move elsewhere? But I also started understanding the cost, not just from the loan, the purchasing, but also in repairing a home. How much does it cost, to build a new kitchen, to remodel your bathroom, to do the simple yard work that sometimes
Mhm.
isn't that simple. So, I mean, there's a lot of stories that I could point to there, but in a nutshell, these things gave me sort of a behind the scenes look at what it means to engage in home ownership.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about my own experience as well, and I did construction for a summer
Hmm.
and realized that it was not in my comparative advantage to continue in that profession. But I think the other thing that you touched on, which I think is so unique to Latino experience, is that you have multi-generational living
Hmm.
at times, and I think that is very unique to Latino experience. Which goes into the next question, which is, as we said, affordability, the cost of housing,
Hmm.
that's a concern for all Americans. But there are unique experiences, unique elements to this for the Latino community.
Hmm.
I mentioned the intergenerational thing, elements to it, but then Latinos live in cities, typically live in cities where the cost of housing is high. Access to credit can be difficult.
Hmm.
Getting a loan, sometimes having disposable cash on hand
Hmm.
when it comes to bidding wars. Talk to me a little bit about that, and then why is this anxiety that Latinos are facing right now when it comes to housing so much more pronounced?
Yeah, to your last word, that's a real concern. It's a reality. It's something that sometimes we're reading it in the news, but that's not the first time we've discussed it because we live it, right? We're living through some of those anxieties. It's a real life conversation that I think all generations are having. But to your first part of the question, I think what's interesting about the experience of Latinos here and why it might be slightly different to some American families, not to all American families, but to some, is one, for example, I'm the son of immigrants, right? What does that mean? That means that my parents grew up in Honduras under a housing system or a purchasing system that is very different to the one in the United States, right? My dad's from a small village. The pricing was very different. You didn't necessarily always do the type of loans that they do here in the United States. So his knowledge coming in now into the United States, same thing with my mom, is completely different. The same thing when we talk about systems like a 401k, right, and retirement. Many of us don't grow up with parents who had a 401k system, sometimes because they're just not aware of it, or sometimes because the line of work that they're in didn't offer that. Same thing, and actually speaking of 401ks, it's interesting. 401ks can be a way to leverage it for purchasing a home. A 401k system does allow you to borrow money that you have invested against yourself. So that means you do pay a very small interest, but you pay it to yourself and you're allowed to put it into a home. That's how I was able to purchase one of my homes. I didn't have a lot of capital, but I had a 401k. I know I went off there a little bit, but the point of 401k in housing is that many of these systems, our parents who are immigrants or grandparents who are immigrants didn't grow up knowing. That means not only do many of us not grow up inheriting homes, we don't grow up inheriting the knowledge of how to obtain a home. And there's a gap there, a knowledge gap of how these systems work. So while many of us, not all of us, but some of us grew up in apartments, renting, even in basements in some places of the country, or the dwelling that is, so for example, in Miami, they have efficiencies. For us, that's what we grew up with. So it's that knowledge gap that I think we have to close, right? I think now, as second generation immigrants, or the sons of immigrants, we need to focus on how are we having these conversations that we're having right now? How are we discussing how to obtain a loan, how to remodel a home, or what are the options that we have? What role does credit play in all this? What are the public policies that are either creating barriers, or what are the public policies that are empowering us to buy that first home, right? We need to have some of those conversations. I also think that when you talk about the experience of Latinos or the correlation of how Latinos think of housing, for us, I think it's a marker of the American dream, right? Our parents want us to graduate from a university. That's seen as part of the American dream by our parents. Owning that first home is seen as part of the American dream. For our parents, it's part of like being established here in this country. You own land, you own a property where your family can grow up. For many of our parents, it's also seen a way of sort of retiring. Some of them do want to return home. Most of them, I think, want to stay here with the grandkids. So it's important for us, and I think there's sometimes even a little bit of pressure, right? Can I obtain that college degree? Can I obtain that first home? Which goes to what you were saying, those anxieties. The anxiety isn't just, hey, the pressure for my family. It's, can I afford this? Can I live up to the expectation? Can I be part of what I know is a industry that has helped many people build wealth, right? When we think of historically top entrepreneurs in the United States, our current president, Donald Trump, right, is known as a real estate mogul. You think of individuals like Warren Buffett. I mean, there's a large or there's a long list of individuals that we know have built their wealth through real estate. And as Latinos, we want to participate in that, right? We want to have our hands in the golden pot as well. And those opportunities do exist. But the reality is that now, today, in 2025, now going into 2026, the landscape has shifted. Buying a home today than 10 years ago is very different. That creates anxieties for us.
Yeah. I do want to get into the generational divide that could exist between younger Latinos and older Latinos when it comes to homeownership. But before we get into that, I'd love for us to go back in time, because not too long ago, in 2019, this conversation would have been different. You had an economy that was doing really well. You had the unemployment rate for Hispanics at a historic low. It hadn't been seen in 50, 60 years, as you know. And home ownership rates for Latinos was at an all-time high. My question to you is what happened then that contributed to that economic boom? And what can policymakers do now, today, to essentially bring back those conditions so that Latinos could be enjoying more of the American dream?
Yeah, that data point is concrete in the sense that it was a historic rise of Latinos owning and purchasing homes. I think it was right around like 2018 or so, and and it trickled into 2019, and I think that's where that data point comes from. But one of the biggest inflection points was the 2017 tax cuts. The reality is that what the tax cuts did is it just looked at again, our tax system as a whole, and it said, how can we make sure that people are able to keep more of their money, right? We've all seen that paycheck where, we're expecting X amount, but we've seen that it goes to the government, it goes to different aspects where we don't keep that money, right? Because we're being taxed on it. The same thing when it comes to investments, right? When you look at real estate, capital gains tax is a big part of it. So there were shifts within the tax system that allowed us to be able to keep more of our money that we worked for. And what happens is when individuals have more funds, they're able to make these purchases, right? They're able to look at their list and say, what are the things that I want to invest in? What are the things that I want to build for my family? And housing typically is at the top of the list. So Latinos, between that period of time, because of those tax cuts, were empowered financially to make a lot of those purchases, right? That has shifted during the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, one of the biggest inflection point was the 2008 financial crash, housing crash, which many folks refer to it. And what happened after that is that a lot of people, the housing market didn't fully recover when it came to the building of homes. That's why one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now is that the number of people looking for homes and the number of homes either available for sale or just the number of homes that are being built they're not keeping up to each other. That's one of the factors. There's several factors, but that's one of the big ones. And that goes back to 2008. Just from that time, many folks slowed down on their investing when it came to building new homes. Also, there was a lot of regulations that came during that time, regulations that we're still living through, living through or feeling as barriers in that market. So while we saw a big advantage, and this isn't just Latinos, this is all Americans, once the tax cuts were reduced for us, right? And we were able to keep more of our money. We're now facing a completely different landscape. The pandemic shifted where people wanted to live. It shifted the states that folks were moving into, but it also shifted supply and demand on actual materials that people have in order to build a home. And again, we're dealing with these regulations that I mentioned, many of them that came after 2008. So the landscape is now a little bit more difficult, or I would say a lot more difficult, especially for that next generation. You ask about the difference between sort of older and younger Latinos. Older Latinos or in some younger took advantage, were able to buy at a lower interest rate. Right after the pandemic, you saw 2.8, 3% interest rates. That's unheard of nowadays. Right now, you're looking at more at 6.7, even 7%, which means it's tougher. And historically, when you raise interest rates, the value of the home tends to go down because the interest rate's higher. We haven't seen that, in part because older generations don't want to sell their home, right? They like the interest rate that they have. They like the equity that they have. So it's a very difficult landscape if you're trying to buy a home for the first time.
Yeah. Well, I got to ask you, Wadi, because when I hear what you're describing and other folks are describing, one of the things that young people particularly are saying is like, look, I hear politicians and elected officials telling me that the way to address the housing crisis and affordability is to do things like freeze or rent and rent control, particularly in big cities. Like I said, a lot of Latinos are living in big cities. And so when you hear politicians and elected officials talk about rent control, talk about freezing the rent, what is your response? Is that the way to go about it?
Yeah, that phrase is not necessarily new, but I think has become very front and center, especially with the election that we saw in New York with Mondami. It's been, I think, almost at the center, one of his most center, or yeah, in the center of his policies. But the reality is, we have data on rent control because there are cities that have implemented this. And it's important to understand when we talk about policies that impact housing, everything from rent to building to just ownership aspect, purchasing aspect. A lot of it is local. Yes, there are federal policies that have an impact, like taxes, like infrastructure, but really a lot of the housing market is impacted by state and local policies. Rent control being one of those, where cities, even some states have tried to push this through. But what we've seen is that, yes, things are unaffordable. So some politicians say, how can we make them affordable? And they're saying by freezing the rent. The problem is that that's just a symptom, right? The question is, why is it that things are unaffordable and how can we address that? And freezing the rent doesn't do that. It's a temporary Band-Aid that actually in the long term does the opposite. It diminishes the incentive of people to build new homes, to be able to invest in properties. And what happens when you do that? If there's no one building, that means the number of people who continue to want to buy continues to increase while there not being enough homes for them to buy. So then whatever is new construction, the prices will be even higher. So it's not a viable strategy. Some states, I'm not sure if it's Portland, but there are some cities who have reversed their policies. They originally had a rent control policy, rent freeze, and they reversed it because they saw that long term it did not solve the problem. If we want to get to what the actual problem is, we got to look at zoning. We got to look at what are the regulations around building. Does it take more time to get permits and to get permission to start building than it does to actually build a home? And in some cities, that is the case. That's a problem, right? We're talking about building a brand new home. How is it that the paperwork and the approval process is taking a lot longer? So there are a lot of these strategies, especially coming from the left, where their strategy is, hey, how can we make the government the one in control of the housing market? How can we make them in control of what prices are, who gets to build, where they get to build, really central planning when it comes to this. And what we've seen in these cities is that doesn't work. What works is actually empowering builders, actually empowering them to be a market for them to build more homes. The more supply there is, the more options that people have, right? There's people who want multifamily, a townhouse, a condo, or some people who want, a single family home. Like, let's create a market so that people have options to buy.
Yeah, I think you got to my next question, which is how can we get involved? I think the Latinos who are listening here may be saying, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but it seems like I don't know where to start. So is the idea to go at the very local level, at the state level? Who actually gets a say in terms of these issues, which you're rightly describing, which are when it comes to zoning, when it comes to the regulations that you're describing, Give us a cheat sheet. How do we get
Yeah.
involved?
I would say there are two key things. One is something that you can personally do in your own household or as yourself as someone who wants to buy a home. And then two, there's something that you can do in your community. And I'll break those down. Number one, I think we need to make sure that we understand the process and how these things work. Do I qualify for a loan? Where is my credit? Do I know a loan officer? Do I know a real estate agent? How am I closing that knowledge gap that we talked about earlier? If you can do that, you're really going to position yourself to be able to buy that first home, right? I think that's a big part of it. But the second part is we tend to pay attention to the big presidential races, right? It's every 4 years. It's the president of the United States, one of the most powerful nations in the world. That's when we tend to go out and vote. That's when we pay attention to people's platforms. But the reality is, again, housing policy happens very much more at the local level, right? Are you paying attention to who your state legislators are? Are you paying attention to who your mayor is? To who the governor is? These roles and these elected officials really matter. You have to go to the local town hall, right? Study up on the issue and then go to the town hall. Be someone who's having a conversation, who's showing up to your elected officials' events when it comes to housing, because it's going to have that impact on you. That's why actually you're seeing a lot of people that are actually moving from a lot of states like New York or even cities like Chicago and Philly, and they're moving to places like Austin and Miami because the housing rules and policies are different. But you're also seeing that folks in these new cities are paying attention to those changes and what are the policies that are going to impact them. Organizations like the Libre Initiative have workshops when it comes to housing, workshops on the side of, again, the knowledge gap, but also events and really fights when it comes to making sure that our property taxes are what they should be, either because they need to reduce the rent or reform how that's happening. When it comes to insurance, we're in places like Florida, right, where you have hurricanes that come by, natural disasters, insurance policy really plays a role. But again, these are such local issues that you have to pay attention and you have to show up. I talked earlier about zoning laws. Many times the people who complain about zoning laws are the people who are coming in, right? And they want to change what's being done. And the people who are trying to stop from the reforms are the people who already live there. So if you live there and hey, I want more affordable housing, you got to go pay attention to what are those laws and make sure that your voice is being heard in the discussion. Again, organizations like Libre, I think, are well positioned because they know who these lawmakers are. They know what the good policies are. So you're not just showing up by yourself. You're showing up with an organization and a grassroots organization that can go and make that impact.
Yeah. No, I keep thinking of NIMBY. I think most people have heard of that, right? But not in my backyard.
Yep.
But that's such a great point. I think, you saw this in the 70s, really, that there's this group of people who, were essentially organizing themselves to prevent, more housing, more construction, more development. And so I think that's a great reminder on how we can get involved and make a difference when it comes to this. I do want to go back to the 2019 economic boom, because I think that we can talk about the regulations that are hampering more housing. But I think the other piece, of course, is the economy. We have a growing, robust economy that's going to create more economic freedom, really, for all Americans, including Latinos, to purchase a home or buy or rent get a rental property. What are other things, what do you think we're missing right now in terms of growing the economy? What's missing? Why does it feel as if a lot of Latinos are working hard, playing by the rules, but still feel like they can't get ahead?
Yeah, I think there's probably three key points in that area, but let me go back to the 2017 tax cuts because I focused on people having a lot more of their own money, but it's important to understand that also in companies, small and large businesses, were impacted in a positive way, right? They also saw a reduction. And what is it that we saw as a result? Many of these companies started to reinvest in expanding their companies. And what happens when you expand a company? You create more employment. So apart from there being a record high of purchases of homes from Latinos, we also saw a record high of Latinos participating in the marketplace, in the labor workforce participation. What this meant is the more Latinos are working, the more a household can have. And something that we talked earlier about the multi-generational living in a household is many Latinos tend to buy homes as a group. What I mean is sometimes it's a son or a daughter buying the home with their parents. In my case, when I bought my first home, my first investment, it was with my sister and my dad. right? Many times you don't have to do this by yourself. So the more people that are working in a household or more people are working in a community, the more that community or that household has as a purchasing power, right? You qualify for a bigger amount in a loan, there's just more income, but that comes from employment. And the 2017 tax cuts really did that. The other thing is regulations, right? A lot of the regulations that existed prior to 2016 that were put in from the Obama administration, the Bill Clinton administration, the Trump administration came in and said, how do we get rid of a lot of these regulations on infrastructure, on building? Because all these things play a role, right? If you're able to build roads, if you're able to build commercial space, if there's movement in your city, that incentivizes the building of homes, right? People where they live, they need to have access to roads, they need to have the grocery stores, the building of schools. All these things play a role and are connected to housing. Also, it's important to understand the role that immigrants play in this place. When it comes to construction, when it comes to building, Hispanic immigrants at a very high rate are the ones doing this building. So again, as Latinos are getting more jobs, they're participating in the housing market, the more they're able to move forward.
Well, absolutely. Wadi, thank you so much for being here. I feel like we covered a lot, and yet there's a lot more to unpack. So maybe for the next time, we can go even deeper into this issue.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.